So we did our checkers with display inline and display block, and we did it with display flex. And when we are doing it with display flex, just to refresh the memory, we have rows, and each row, it's a div by itself, and it has display flex, and we call it the flex box. And inside of it, we have other divs, which are still display block, but because the container, the parent element, is display flex, it kind of changes the way they behave. Kind of ignores them of being display block. Not always ignores, but it does override the default behavior of taking the entire line and just add it as some to some flex box. The next way I want to create this checkers board is using display grid. And if in display flex, and if you remember, I'm using this CSS tricks website that has this documentation for display flex, we can divide the CSS properties of display flex into two parts, two groups. One properties for the container, and the other one properties for the items. Now the container, it's a flex box, so it's a row and all of the elements are inside of it, and they can expand and shrink, and we can arrange the space inside of them. Now, when we talk about display grid, there is a lot to talk about it. And again, I'm using CSS tricks. You see how handful it is, even for display grid. Just Google CSS grid, and I think this will be the first result you will get. And if not, just scroll down, it will be one of the first. So when it comes to display grid, and when we create a grid container, we are not defining a row. We are defining a whole, we can think of it as a table, which has a rows and also columns. And this is kind of counterintuitive to what we did so far. Because if you remember divs, their default behavior is display block, their default CSS, so they're blocking the entire row. And if we're changing it to display flex, it's still blocking the entire row, but we can arrange elements in a flexible way inside of them. When we talk about display grid, it's no longer a row. It's and think of it like a window or like a table. It has rows and columns. And we can tell the browser how do we want to arrange other elements inside this div. So we want one element to be in this cell. So you can see it's 40 pixels and 25%. And the next one in another cell, and so on and so forth. So we can create very complicated UIs and grid elements spread on the grid using just few CSS lines using the CSS grid. So let me go back to the code and I will show an example how to use it. So first of all, I want to comment out this checkers board that we created before with display flex. And I will create a new one, checkers board. And there we have it. I will go back to my website, refresh the page. And if I will inspect this part, where is our checkers board? Just a simple div. You see it's here. It has nothing. It has no content inside, so it has almost no width and height. It has some borders, so you can see it has those 2 pixels. It's coming from the border of the checkers board. Now what I want to do is go here to my CSS and change this one to display grid. Okay? And refresh the page. Now, first thing you can see that it kind of blocks the entire row. It's because I changed it from inline block to grid. And grid on the outside behaves like display block, but you can see that I can add some functionalities to the inside of it. So checkers board, you can see it has 8 rows and 8 columns. In this case, all of the rows and columns are evenly distributed. Okay, they have the same height and width. If each cell has the same height and width, then it's the same value. So I want to describe using CSS and using the grid properties this table. You can think of it as table of rows and columns. And I want to tell the browser that my div, my checkers board, is going to have 8 rows, and each row is going to have some fixed height. We'll call it 50 pixels. In our case, we can of course choose whatever we want, but this will be 50 pixels for now. And in each row, we're going to have 8 columns. And again, the width of each column is going to be 50 pixels. Okay, so let me first of all describe in CSS how it looks like. So grid, template, rows. I will start with the rows. And I want to have 50 pixels, 8 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes. So what I'm describing here, that this checkers board, which is display grid, is going to have 8 rows of 50 pixels height each. Okay. And let me do the same for the columns. So grid template columns, and I will just copy paste it. Okay. Now, an easier way of writing it, because I'm repeating myself with the same value, instead of just writing 50 pixels every time, let me comment that. So I'll show you a nicer way of achieving the same goal. I'm going to use a CSS function that is called repeat. And I want it to do 50 pixels 8 times. Okay, I'm just telling it to repeat this 50 pixels 8 times. I'm going to do the same for the columns, just so we will have nicer code. And I'm going to keep this commented so you will have it as a reference, so you will understand what this repeat does, because you have it up here. Okay, and let me go back to my page, refresh, go over this one. Oh, I think I have a mistake here. So repeat, I shouldn't write 50 pixels 8, I should write 8 and then 50 pixels. I think this is the right syntax for repeat. Let's do it and see if we don't get this error. Yeah, now it's okay. And one thing you can see that going over the checkers board, if you'll see to the left, the browser is highlighting the checkers board div, and you see distributing, it has those purple lines telling me how the grid is distributed, or what is the structure of the display grid. Okay, so I have 8 rows and 8 columns, which is nice. This is kind of what I wanted for my checkers board. And you can already see I have nothing inside. So even though I have those purple lines, and it's only a hint for us as developers to see what's going on, I don't see anything inside. I need to put some divs inside of it. And I want to put in total 64 divs, right? And those divs are going to be distributed inside the checkers board. Let me try with one div. Let me go here, div.box. Refresh the page, go over here, and you can see that the first div, even if I'll remove the width and height, I don't need them in this case because I'm using display grid, you can see the blue highlight. You can see that because I created this display grid, it puts this div in the first column. So let's create another one. This one now I want it to be black, so let me copy this class from here. Refresh, and now I'm getting 2 divs. One of them is at the first cell, and the second one is at the second cell. And I can keep going. I can just copy paste all of it. Okay, let me do it just once. And now I have 4 divs. What is the logic behind display grid? And again, I can delete those width and height because I already have them defined in the grid container. So what is the logic? Once we describe how we want our grid container to behave, how we want to distribute the area inside the grid container, we just left on providing it with elements. And what the browser will do, it will distribute the elements inside the cells. So the first element is going to be in the first cell, and the second one in the second cell. And I can add up to how many elements I want, but in this case, 64 elements, until it will fill the entire grid. Now, one thing you can see, let me just do that. Let me copy this one here. How many do I have here? Great. So now it fills the entire line. You see, I have one line of 8 cells. If I will keep on adding, now I need to have a black one because I need to change the order of the cells. But if I will add one more or even 2 more, you see it's starting to add in them in a new line because it knows that the rows are 50 pixels, the columns are 50 pixels, and I have 8 from each. So when it finishes the first row, it just put it in the second row, and it keeps on going. The more divs I will add, it will fill up the cells until it will end up with the size, with the space it has. Okay, so one cool thing about it that you can see, if before in our display flex we had to wrap each row in a div, when this was the flex box, in this case we don't have to. We can just put 64 divs inside this display grid, and the browser will know how to distribute them inside specific rows, even if they don't have any div around them, wrapping them. And I think it's very cool. I think it's very handy. And once you understand it, it kind of makes sense. You want to describe how your UI or how your container is behaving and how to distribute elements inside of it. Okay, let me just delete it. I'm going to do some trick here. I'm going to use something called emmet. Hopefully it will work in the first try. So I want to have div box plus, and next to it I want to have a div.box black, right? This is the box black. And I want those pairs to have 4 of them. And then I want to have a row which is the other way around. So let me just copy it. Oh, I need to add here also box. I'm doing some trick just to fill in everything. And box. And all of these times 4. Let's see if it works. I have 64 divs. Let's see the outcome. Yes, I have a checkers board. So I have 64 divs with box black, and I have those one after the other because remember, after each line, after 8 cells, I want to switch the order of the colors because this is how the checkers board looks like. So I have 64 divs with the classes, and because checkers board is display grid and it has this pattern of how the grid should look like, how many rows and how many columns and what the width and height of them should be. Oops. And go over here and it just distributes all of those divs inside the grid container. Okay, just puts the first one in the first cell and it keeps on adding more and more divs depending on the pattern that I described before or the template.